Welcome back with my ranking of the entire Suede catalog, including Antidepressants, which was just released today. I'm recording this on September 5th, 2025. So this is in total the 10th studio album, but the 5th in their second era. There are two distinct Suede eras. I mean, there's three if you count the Butler years as a era itself, but there's the era which started with the debut album in 1993, and I think New Morning was released like 2001, and after that they released a best of album, and then they split up, and then like 10 years later they came back. In 2013 they released Bloodsports, and after Bloodsports, Antidepressants is now the 5th of the second era. So there's 5 albums now in both eras. And we'll start, of course, with my least favorite Suede album, which is the last from the first era, which is A New Morning. It was titled that way, I guess, with some hope that this would be like a restart, a revamp, a reboot of Suede. Gone was the decadence and the hedonism, at least in the lyrics of this album, maybe not in real life. They were really very burned out after, very wild years in the 90s, also with lots of drug taking and so on, and lots of drama involving the band. And it sounds like that, they want to come across like, now we're sober, and now we're more like it's really a kind of a bucolic album almost, with lots of acoustic guitars and lots of, the first single from the album was called Positivity, and it tries to be an album full of positivity, and it has its moments. I mean, Positivity is one of the highlights of that album. Then Obsessions, which almost sounds like a connecting song, connecting that era before, that albums before with this New Morning era. Those are the first 2 tracks of the album in the tracklist, so maybe the band was also aware that these are probably the strongest songs on this album. All in all, it's a kind of a directionless album, this attempt at restarting as a folky act, but it doesn't seem real. It doesn't fit with what Suede are supposed to be, also in this era at least. And yeah, they're a bit tired, and it's like an empty tank album in a way, and it's kind of logical that soon after that they split up. Number 11, and you all are thinking probably, why do I have 12 albums in this ranking? There are only 10 albums of Suede. Well, you'll see it as we go along. Number 11 is Head Music, the album before A New Morning. Must have been 1999 when it came out. I bought it on the day it came out, and I also saw them on the tour to this album, and I really loved the album back then, and was really excited to see them live. So I should have, and I kind of have, good memories with this album, but on re-listen, if you re-listen to that album, it's already, the warning signs that they are about to be burned out on A New Morning. They're already here. It's a bit empty. Also the lyrics, all those Brett Anderson lyrical cliches. The use of words like asphalt and neon and things like that. It's a bit over the top on this album. It's a bit like Suede are becoming a cliche version of Suede, something that Suede shouldn't be about. Brett Anderson is also in interviews these days very proud about not being a nostalgia act. But in 1999 they were about to become a nostalgia act, a Suede tribute band. But again, big highlights on this album. So I wouldn't say that this is a total waste of time, this album, at least if you like Suede, at least. It has its moments. The first single, Electricity, again, is a bit a Suede by numbers song, so the lyrics, like I said, but it's, it has a sort of vitality. It's this typical, very, very ballsy rock Suede song, and maybe one of the 2 or 3 best ballads they ever did. Everything Will Flow is also on this album. She's in Fashion is okay, but it's already starting to sound like they're fighting for the inspiration on this album. Number 10 is the comeback album, I think from, when was it, 2013. I think they reunited for 2 shows, one of them in the Royal Albert Hall. I think that was already in 2011, if I'm not mistaken. That show is also in full length on YouTube. It's a brilliant comeback show. I think they only intended it as a kind of one-off. It was a charity. I think it was for Roger Daltrey's cancer charity probably, and it was just a one-off show. That was how it was planned, the greatest hits one-off show, and everyone, the band but also the audience, everyone suddenly realized, wow, we're too good to not to reform. But then the other question was, are they still able to write great new songs? They already proved with those comeback shows that they're still great performers, or maybe even better performers than back in the day. After the wild days of the 90s, I think really they all came down a bit, got sober, and on a new morning the burnout was still too fresh to have any positive effect, that soberness. But by 2010 it really showed that they were back very rejuvenated and vital, and that was the basis for that comeback. But like I said, the question was, is it only a live comeback, Suede the nostalgia act, which they never wanted to become, or are they able to get the inspiration back and write and record a great new album? And they did. Bloodsport, that's already much better than the previous 2 albums, Head Music and A New Morning. It's really, in fact, it's a great comeback album, and it's really strange that this is, according to my ranking, their worst of the comeback albums, because this is already a very, very good album, and I think not many people, including me, expected them to usher in their second era with such a great album. Yeah, like those shows in 2010 or 2011 already hinted at, the band is really rejuvenated, and they really want to prove themselves with this second era, and also they have now they have more fun. I think in the 90s they were a bit of a too cool for school kind of band. You never really saw them smiling or anything. They had this very arrogant kind of aura. But in the second era of Suede are really having fun on stage and also on the records. It doesn't mean that their songs are now fun songs. They're still very dramatic, melancholic songs, but the energy is really a very vital sound that the band have kind of perfected in those last 14-15 years now. Number 9, maybe a bit controversial, because it's the Blue Hour, which is very often hailed as maybe the best of their second era albums. I also like it, from this point on, or from Bloodsports on. I really like the albums. This is them again trying, like I said, they don't want to be a nostalgia act, but no one can really get away from himself. So I have to compare it to their previous work, and this is a bit like their second Dogman Star in a way. It's also this very symphonic, cinematic, lush sounding album. This is the least rock and roll sounding album of the comeback albums. Lots of strings and orchestration and so on, and in this sense it's really a great album, and it's a good listening experience. And it's the cool thing about this album is that it's kind of a side turn, a bit different or very different to the other albums of this phase. So it's really an interesting album, but it's still not my favorite album from the second era of Suede. Next album is Night Thoughts, and this is really, this is a strange edition I have here. I don't know if all the CD versions of this album are like this, but I guess this is more like a deluxe edition, because it also contains a Blu-ray disc with a concert film from that era, from that time. Night Thoughts. That's the album after Bloodsports. It's already a bit more lush and produced than Bloodsport, but it's not as symphonic and lush as the Blue Hour would be. I think this is kind of a sweet spot, the best elements of Bloodsport and the best elements of the Blue Hour in a way. So it has this, it's a very dramatic sounding, also kind of a dark sounding album, and yeah, it's a fantastic album in a way. Number 7, and that's one of the 2 reasons why this is a top 12 and not a top 10. I wanted to include some of the kind of side things as well, because I think they're relevant to the Suede story. And I start with sci-fi lullabies, science fiction lullabies, the 2 CD disc set from the late 90s, B-sides of Suede. Next to Oasis, Suede had the best B-sides of all the Britpop, so-called Britpop bands from the 90s. And this is the album that proves that, it's their kind of master plan, what the master plan was for Oasis. But I think it's also better, even better than the master plan. So in a way, the B-sides of Suede are even a notch better than the B-sides of Oasis. Like Oasis, also Suede have some B-sides that are kind of real classics where fans think that those are among the best songs the band ever did. I think so too. My Insatiable One is kind of a classic. My Dark Star, Killing of a Flash Boy, those are all brilliant songs that could have been A-sides. No one would have complained if any of those 3 tracks wouldn't have been relegated to a B-side but an A-side. So this is really, it's not really an album that they produced as a studio album, but it's a great collection of Suede songs. It also shows how productive the band was in those early years, especially in the Butler years. In like 2 or 3 years, they did so many so great songs. In terms of productivity, they only can be compared with the Jam and the Smiths maybe, or the Beatles, for example, which was also a very productive band. Many great songs in a short span of time. That's what I mean. So yeah. Sci-fi lullabies, great compilation. And number 6 is now the new album, the album that was released today. I just listened 2 times to it. I was familiar with the tracks they released beforehand, the singles, if you still can call it singles, which is Dancing with the Europeans and Disintegrate. But the rest of the album, I listened to it twice now. It's a brilliant album. Again, there's still not a weak album in the second era. I would say that New Morning and Head Music are kind of weak albums, but the second era, maybe the highs of the second era aren't as high as the album highs of the first era, but there's no real low. And again, Antidepressants, brilliant album. And I already mentioned the two songs that were released before, Disintegrate and Dancing with the Europeans, 2 of their best second era singles, I would say. The things that started with Bloodsport, they still go on and go on, this strange way of rejuvenation, of sounding fresher, better and more intense with each new album. It reminds me a bit of The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde, which is probably one of the big influences as a lyricist to Brett Anderson, I could imagine. They sound younger and younger with each new album. They started out sounding young because they were young, and then they sounded so old, washed up and tired by 2000, and then they come back in 2013 and it gets more vital and vital with each new album. And other highlights next to the 2 songs I already mentioned are Trance State, again a great Suede rocker. It's also a very rocking album again, like most of those comeback albums. But there's one great, I don't know if you can call it ballad, but June Rain starts out as a ballad. It starts out as a song, maybe in the tradition of the Wild Ones, which is maybe the best Suede song ever. Not my favorite. It's in my top 5 favorite Suede songs, but it's not my favorite. But many people, including Brett Anderson and also Bernard Butler, would say that Wild Ones is their best song. I think the song June Rain starts out a bit like that, but then it builds and builds, and then in the end it's one of those Suede rockers, big anthems. and it's a great song. And one thing that I really noticed again with listening to the new album, of the four great so-called Britpop bands, Oasis, Blur, Pulp, Suede. Suede is really the only of the four that really stayed relevant. Oasis have this great live comeback now, but they're a nostalgia act. The reason why this is so successful is because it's a kind of cheap nostalgia they are selling, and it works, and it's alright, but there's nothing new, innovative about that. The Blur album, The Ballad of Darren, in hindsight was a bit of a disappointment. Isn't really that great of an album. And more Pulp, the new Pulp album is good, but it's nowhere near as good, and also Pulp are nowhere near as prolific as Suede. Pulp had this one album now in 24 years or something, and Suede have now the fifth album, and I would say 4 of those 5 albums are better than More Pulp, although More Pulp is a good album. So they're the only ones who stayed relevant, who didn't become a nostalgia act. I also think that these days Suede play only or mostly new songs, second era songs during their concerts, which is also like a statement of of power, and of how good they are and how good they feel about themselves these days, and also that their fans accept that. The fans also have to accept them only playing new songs, but the fans are happy with it. I'm also happy with it, because those are brilliant songs, and we all know the classics from the 90s. And yeah, in general, Brad especially seems so rejuvenated, and I think one of the tricks he does is that he doesn't try to emulate his songwriting persona from 30 years ago, which would be the safe way to go. Still singing about things like asphalt and neon and those typical Suede subjects. But now he's singing from his perspective as a 50-something now, and shows that also as a 50-something guy you can make really intense, dramatic sounding rock music in a way. That's also, maybe Suede are even kind of unique as a band in that way. Their career trajectory is so unique, and so I think also that Suede is maybe a band that will be remembered more and more fondly as years go by. I think they're like a wine that gets older, that gets better the older it gets. I think by the late 90s they kind of lost the Britpop wars, and were like at best the fourth biggest of the Britpop bands, and now I think if you put all together, if you add it all up, they probably should be remembered as the number one of all those Britpop bands. With their, in terms of their catalog, but also of them as a live band. I saw them 2 years ago on the Autofiction tour, and they were awesome. It was one of the best concerts I've seen in many years. And talking about Autofiction is my number 5, which is the album before Antidepressants, from 2022, I think. So that makes Autofiction my favorite of the second era of Suede. It's a tiny little bit better to me than Antidepressants. It's even more rocking, it's even more intense. Antidepressants, like I said, with the song June Rain, is a song that is an album that tries to have a bit more variation, I think. Autofiction is really a great rock album. I also think that Autofiction has the best of the second era songs. The Only Way I Can Love You, I think this is as good as the big classics from the 90s. This is really a fantastic song. It's really almost a magical album, like the big masterpieces of Suede. But before we get to the big masterpieces of Suede, this is the other outlier album. This is the other reason why this is not a top 10 but a top 12. I decided to include the Tears album, Here Come the Tears, the one-off project by Brad and Bernard Butler, Bernard Butler left the band during the Dogman Star sessions, so in 1994. So he's only on the first two albums and didn't even tour the second album. After him, Richard Oakes joined the band. But to someone like me, it was such great news to, when was it, 2004, 2005? I think this came out in 2005, but the news probably 2004. The news that Brett Anderson and Bernard Butler, have made up and are making a new album together. You have to remember Suede were split up by that point. They split up around 2002, so there was no more Suede. Brett made some solo albums in those years between the two Suede eras, which are okay, but which I wouldn't put in this ranking because they aren't really that Suede adjacent. They're solo albums. This I would say is Suede adjacent because it has the two initial songwriters, the original songwriting duo of Suede. So I can say this is like Sci-Fi Lullabies. This is kind of a Suede album to me, and it's so much better than I expected it to be. I was so hyped for it, for the comeback of Brett and Bernard, but there's also this potential when something like that is announced that you have too high expectations and then you're disappointed. But this didn't disappoint me. It probably disappointed them commercially. It was a kind of a flop, with all that hype that Brett and Bernard are back together. I think they and also I think we all thought this would be a big success, at least in the UK. But like I said, by the late 90s, Suede were so burned out and so uncool. They lost, to Oasis, Blur and Pulp, the momentum they built in the early 90s. They lost all that. So I think it wasn't really cool to like them, and so no one really except the hardcore fans waited for this album. But this is one of the most underrated albums of that decade, the noughties. This is really perfect. If this would be a Suede album, a real Suede album, this would be one of their masterpieces. This would be up there with their best work. And funnily enough, I think people, including me, expected this to be an album in the way of the first Suede album or Dogman Star, Butler and Anderson together again. But to me it sounds like the second part to Coming Up, which was the first album after Bernard left, because like Coming Up, this is a very pop. Again, strange that it wasn't commercially more successful. This is also one of the most pop sounding albums in this ranking video, in this catalog. Next to Coming Up, this is the album with the most potential hits, I would say. None of those songs were particularly big hits, not even in the UK, but this has 4 or 5 songs that are really so catchy and great hook lines, great melodies, great choruses. Songs like Refugees, Autograph, Imperfection, Lovers, Beautiful Pain. If those would have been Suede singles in the mid-90s, I think they would all have been top 10 hits in Britain. So this is a very underrated, and there's also a reason why I wanted to talk about this album, because it's such a forgotten album in a way, but this is really great. And I know that Bernard Butler is a very difficult kind of person. He comes across like that in interviews and so on, and he still hasn't, even by that time and after that, he still hasn't kind of, really gotten over things that happened with Suede and him. So it wouldn't be easy to integrate him back into the band. But I think their second era would have been even better as a 6-piece. I don't want to have Richard Oakes sacked, which is a deserving member of the band, but maybe as a 6-piece with 2 guitar players and Neil Codling just on keyboards. But 6-piece Suede with Bernard Butler, Richard Oakes, Brett Anderson, Neil Codling, Matt Osman, and the drummer, I think Simon Gilbert is the name. That would have been very interesting and probably even musically even better than the second era we've gotten, with input from Butler as well. But I understand that the relationships are very difficult, even between Brett and Bernard, although they made up when they did this album. But I think, especially with the other Suede members, I think Matt Osman, for example, and Bernard Butler didn't really get along. So I can understand that he's not part of the group. after they reformed. But you know, this album shows that Brett and Bernard still, you know, working together, still produces great results. My number 3, and now those are really the masterpieces. You know, this is kind of a masterpiece, a forgotten masterpiece, but the next 3 albums are the undisputed Suede masterpieces, and those are also the first 3 albums of the band. My third favorite Suede album is the self-titled debut from 1993 that kickstarted Britpop. You know, no one, especially Suede, really wanted to be labeled Britpop, but it was really them who got it started, because an article about, first and foremost about them, I think in NME or some music paper, first used the term Britpop to describe this wave of music, and it was an article that focused mostly on Suede and on this phase, this early phase of Suede. You know, they really started a big hype in the early 90s, and when this came out, they already were, you know, on the day this came out, they already were the biggest band in Britain. Soon after that, you know, Oasis became a thing, Blur returned with Parklife, and then in 95 also Pulp. So they quickly were, you know, lost momentum, and in the, like I said, in the late 90s, they were at best, you know, the number 4 in most of people's opinions. You know, at that time, they also were my number 4. I still loved them because I loved all those groups. They were my, you know, if you asked me in 1997, 1998, my ranking would have been Oasis, Blur, Pulp, Suede. But these days, I would say Suede are the number 1. I think, you know, if you put it all together, era 1, era 2, them as a studio band, them as a live band, I think they should be remembered as the best of all those groups from Britain from the 90s, to so-called Britpop groups. Yeah, but back in the day, and when this came out, they were undisputed the number 1 band in Britain. And what a fantastic debut album, one of the best debut albums of the 90s. It starts off with So Young, which is in my top 5 favorite Suede songs. It should be in every fan's top 5, or at least top 10, I would say. Then Animal Nitrate, which was one of the biggest early hits. Other great songs on this album is Pantomime Horse, which is one of the first, you know, really of those more lush, dramatic, ballady kind of songs. The Drowners, great single. Metal Mickey, great single. The Next Life, again, great ballad, and also a song that hints at what the second album would be like. Fantastic debut album. My number 2 album by Suede is Coming Up, 1996. This is the album, you know, Bernard Butler left in 1994. In 1995-ish, Richard Oakes and Neil Codling joined the group. Richard Oakes, who was like 17 or 18 years old at that time, and was recruited because he was such a big Suede fan. You know, he knew all the guitar parts of Bernard Butler so well because he was a fan. You know, he was a 17-year-old Suede fan, and he was the best at the job, you know, at trying to imitate. At first it was really more about imitating Bernard Butler's style before he, you know, got more and more into his own, and then developed his own style for Suede. So that was really a strange decision, and I think maybe many people, including me at the time, thought this can't work out that way. And then they also added Neil Codling, which was like keyboards and second guitar in a way, who's also very young at the time. So really strange way of replacing a very important member. You know, Bernard Butler, not just hailed as the guitar god of the Britpop era, but also the very important co-songwriter, part of the songwriting team, Brett Anderson, Bernard Butler. So to replace him with a 17-year-old, this shouldn't have worked, but it worked so well. You know, on this album especially, it's really more about sounding like Bernard Butler, but the songs on this album, which were partly already co-written with Richard Oakes, but you know, were mostly Brett Anderson songs, I would say. They are so fresh and different from the first 2 albums, and this is what makes this album so great. I mean, I think it would have been the end of Suede if they tried with those new members, with those insecure young new members, to kind of emulate the previous album Dogman and Star, which would, this monumental album Dogman and Star, but they went a complete different direction. Like I said, stylistically, sound-wise, they're still sounding like Suede because Richard Oakes basically imitates Bernard Butler in a way, but the songwriting and the mood of the songs is so different from the first two albums, because this is one of the most optimistic, one of the most pop-tastic Britpop albums of all time. This is like the ABBA album. It's like ABBA Gold meets Britpop. It's like ABBA Gold meets Different Class by Pulp. This is just anthem after anthem, and this is also like almost like a thriller. Like Michael Jackson's Thriller was for the 80s. This is like for Britpop, with like 6 or 7 singles that were all hits. So it never had a #1 hit, but all those songs were like top 10 hits, top 15 hits in Britain. Songs like Trash, Film Star, Saturday Night, Beautiful Ones. Brad Anderson, he was really with his back against the wall after Bernard left, and people like Noel Gallagher ridiculed him and them in public, saying that without Bernard Butler they are completely lost, and they were all wrong, because Brad really, for some reason, was inspired to write those life-affirming glam anthems, and Richard Oakes fits like a glove, and this is the perfect guitar player for this album. Neil Codling also does what he does brilliantly. The rest of the band is really maybe also relieved. Maybe this is an album where you can really hear people being relieved of Bernard Butler, who was a genius but also was so difficult to work with. So this is really an album it's a bit like a middle finger album. I show you all. I show Bernard Butler, I show Noel Gallagher, I show all the doubters, the naysayers. So this is one of the greatest comebacks in a way. This is I always talk about 2 eras of Suede, but in fact there's 3 eras, and this is the start of the second era, and no one expected this to sound like that and to be as good as this. So coming up, maybe, and this is maybe also the reason why it's not my #1, it's a bit too superficial to be #1, because #1 is this very very deep sounding album, this very #1 album has this deepness, and this monumental greatness that this album really doesn't have. It's like in the lyrics to the song Trash, where he sings about being trash and being about corny. This is the mission statement for this album. So it's, in a way, it's superficial, but it has to be superficial to be like it is. But my #1 album is the opposite of being a superficial album. I can show you the CD version, but also I have and I've forgotten to show you Autofiction. Here's Autofiction, only have it on vinyl, not on CD. And the vinyl version of Dogman Star, I have like an American edition, because in America the band had to be renamed the London Suede for legal reasons, because I guess there's a band in America that's called Suede already. This album, double album on vinyl, of course, like basically all 90s albums were too long, but this isn't too long. This is an album that really deserves to be a double album as vinyl, at least. This is one of the best albums, not just Britpop albums. This is one of the best albums of the 90s, and maybe this is also one of the best real British albums of all time. And it's like a symphony. This is like especially the second half, but maybe, the complete thing is like a symphony, because the first track introducing the band is like an overture. We Are the Pigs. The second track is also like a mission statement. This is very lyrically and musically a very symphonic album. It includes The Wild Ones, which I said it is not my favorite, but it's maybe my third, fourth, fifth favorite Suede song. My favorite Suede song is a song that both songwriters of it, Brad Anderson and Bernard Butler, both hate and have claimed to be the one Suede song that they hate, which was the one-off single Stay Together, which was on no album, and which was the the farewell song of Bernard Butler in a way. I like Stay Together, and I know what people don't like about it, that it's too cliche suede. It's like the songs on Head Music where they're becoming like a parody of themselves. But on Stay Together, the whole dramatic nature of the song works for me because it's that farewell of Bernard Butler song. So it has some emotional weight to me. Stay Together. It's not like a vignette or something. It's really the core of Suede in a song. It's like a concentrate of Suede in a song. But the Wild Ones on this album, back to this album, Wild Ones of course is one of their best and most beloved songs. Wonderful song. Then of course there's those last 4 or 5 songs which are really like a opera, like a symphony. You know, I don't like. I'm one of the few people who doesn't like Queen, and I don't like A Night at the Opera by Queen. But this is kind of A Night of the Opera kind of rock album. This is how it's supposed to be made if you're a rock band and you want to make a rock opera or symphony. You know, those last songs, The Two of Us, Black or Blue, The Asphalt World, Still Life. This is one. This is even better than the Abbey Road medley in terms of medleys, if you can call this a medley. This is one of the most moving and most perfectly executed, like 20-25 minutes things on an album in rock history, in my opinion. So this alone would make this the best Suede album. But then, you know, on side 1 it also has, like I said, songs like The Wild Ones and so on. So it's really, this is really a masterpiece, and I'm glad that Suede are still around, but not like Oasis, around as a nostalgia act, but, you know, really doing fresh sounding, great new things also these days. You wouldn't have thought this in like 1998, 1999 or 2000, but it turns out that Suede are really we will be remembered as one of the really big English bands, and maybe even more so than Oasis and Blur. So thank you very much for watching. Till next time.